Thank you, Arctic Acoustic. I love the music. Welcome back to Hanging with History. This is Season 1, That Miracle That Happened, That One Time. And this is Episode 4, The Vikings, or Odin's Revenge. This is a 2022 re-recording of the original with minor changes in script. The format is quirky, and I take a position that is only thinly supported by facts about Pelagianism, its spread, and the penetration of the Joseph of Arimathea myth. And yet some historians love this stuff, defend it up and down, in minute detail, and I want to introduce it to you. An important authority briefly appears to call bullshit on my narrative, which seemed like good enough balance to me. The specific factual references to Pelagianism are real. This was a super hot conflict within the Roman Church. It had a body count. This is the question of free will versus a fully determined future. Same with the Joseph of Arimathea specific facts. Philip II and other Spaniards in mid-16th century England really did get this myth presented to them as obvious facts that everyone knows. You can talk to me about this or anything else in these episodes by email at hangingwithhistorypodcast@gmail.com. On with the show. The last episode, we went from a surface-level look at the good and bad of permanently settled cities to the rise of Christianity within a Greco-Roman context and the whole social package that came with Christianity. We mentioned England exactly once, with the Christian missionaries in the 600s in Kent, trying to convince warrior Anglo-Saxons to give up their multiple wives, stop marrying their cousins, and uphold love and worship a guy who was captured by his enemies and nailed to a piece of wood.
You're making it sound impossible, but we know it actually worked.
Did it, though? Hey, everybody, this is Dragon Slayer. She is someone really interested in reasoning and thought, cognitive bias, and just someone great to hang out with. To counter your assertion, did it though? In the end, did the Saxons believe what the missionaries were preaching? Or did they nod yes and say the right words and carry on oppressing the Roman Celts they conquered so severely that they wiped out their very language?
Well, you said something before about hypocrisy being the tribute vice pays to virtue. But it doesn't matter if the first converts had mental reservations, because eventually England became a conventional Christian country like all the rest.
Welcome back, Waka98. I love your Australian voice. Did they, though? There was a purely English version of Christianity right at the beginning. Pelagianism, a doctrine espoused by a British monk in Italy, got a foothold in Britain. Among other things, it emphasized free will and the possibility of salvation through good action. It also did not require grace to come from the church. On the one hand, it contended with the doctrine of predestination laid out by Augustine, but mainly it smelled too close to Donatism, so it was a red-hot issue for the popes. Eventually, the pope sends St. Germanus to visit Britain to combat bishops espousing Pelagius's views in the period before independence in the early 5th century. Later, Augustine, not that Augustine, comes in the early 600s to assert the dominance of Rome, which probably meant payment of money in addition to who could decide on doctrine, to convince the British bishops to proselytize among the Anglo-Saxons, even though this seems sure to cause martyrdom. We basically get all this from Bede's history, but it raises questions. Here are these non-Anglo-Saxon bishops in an Anglo-Saxon-ruled country having religious councils and disputations. What underlying reality does this reflect? Anyway, the authority of Rome was rejected by the British until late in the 8th century. The locals would keep their money, their local saints, their way to calculate Easter. Meanwhile, a pro-Roman faction begins to build within the church, among the Anglo-Saxons. Possibly critically, the English had this myth of Joseph of Arimathea. Yes, the same Joseph of Arimathea from the Gospels, or you may have heard the name in Monty Python and the Holy Grail. and even Jesus himself visiting Britain. William Blake wrote a great poem about this Joseph of Arimathea legend, set to music later by Hubert Parry. Here's just a few seconds of it. Just to show you that you know that story. This sounds just like a story, but at a time when Christianity is central to the ordinary life of birth and education, marriage and death, it might encourage a sense of specialness. Many believed passionately, others just a little, that Britain had the earliest church, founded directly by Joseph of Arimathea. There are accounts of people in European courts, Philip II of Spain among them, hearing British people with full seriousness tell them how their church is the oldest, founded by Joseph of Arimathea or even Jesus himself. They were also well aware of the missionary activities of the early Celtic church. And there were some interesting religious innovations that came out of Britain, or really Ireland originally, and that is private confession and privately performed penance. And wow, the opposite of that, public confession and public penance would be pretty radically different. This is something I'd like to learn more about. This seems like a major flaw in a religion. Imagine something like Alcoholics Anonymous, but without the anonymous part.
I think you're splitting hairs here. The part about private confession is interesting, but irrelevant. The important thing is that after the Norman conquest, you had a conventional church.
Otto, you are spouting bullshit. Don't be such an arrogant asshole.
Oh, hi, Papa. That's my dad. Everyone meet my dad. He's a pretty brilliant thinker and likes to keep both feet on the ground and stay realistic. He doesn't mind pointing out my bullshit when necessary. And I'm going to stubbornly stay with this line for a little bit, despite Dragon Slayer's intelligently rational points and my dad's practical psychological one. The stories were told and eventually written down that Joseph of Arimathea, the guy who buries Jesus and is referenced in a prophecy of Isaiah, goes to Britain to establish the church. He receives the Holy Grail from a visitation by Christ. He's an important character in some of the non-canonical Gospels, in addition to his brief appearances in Mark and Matthew. There are historians who posit that even the post-Norman British believed passionately, if almost secretly, in the pre-Roman foundation of the church by Joseph of Arimathea. Anyone who takes a tribal or rooting interest will wish to believe this. And people do that, don't they? It feels like some proto-nationalism is going on here.
Why would there be a problem believing that Joseph of Arimathea came to Britain?
Because that undermines Rome's claim to lead religion. It's based on the claim that Peter and Paul founded the church in Rome, and that therefore, and because apostolic succession, everyone has to do what they say. The divine foundation of the British Church implies a freedom vis-à-vis Rome that other polities did not have. Also, Rome's claim to dominance wasn't a particularly logical position, by the way. Normally I don't say that out loud, but muddy thinking about this will have consequences later. And the Norman conquest was 1066, but it took many decades for it to be thorough, longer than that to extend to Wales. And as far as conventional goes, it wasn't really a long time on a medieval scale that we see the rise of Lollardy in England and the protests of John Wycliffe and the first English language Bible. And the first time that we have surviving texts of the Joseph of Arimathea legend is from the 12th century, which is after the Norman conquest. And Britain is the first country whose church successfully splits from Catholicism. Sorry, Bohemia, we know you tried, fought valiantly, and suffered greatly.
Okay, so you have this theory that England was special because of its religious foundation myth.
It's not my theory. Paul Johnson and many other historians lay it out. even though sharp lines of cause and effect are hard to draw. It's out of fashion to say that Joseph of Arimathea provided background support to Henry VIII and Wolsey, but it used to be more common. Among other things, it's presented as a reason for the relatively peaceful split from Rome compared to the lakes of blood shed on the continent. Really, seas of blood in France and oceans of blood in Germany. And it's really just an intro to the Britain is special as a cultural construct idea. Let's start that Britain is special construct. It's important for a key theory of the origins of the Industrial Revolution. It's relevant to theory number 1, presented in episode 70, if you want to skip ahead before coming back. I'm going to skip over the mild climate island nation stuff for now, as it's boring, although it might be important later, and it's often misunderstood in popular history. For now, let me say that in a time of really terrible land transportation, which was the situation before the end of the Roman Empire until the beginning of early modern times, being within reach of the sea or a navigable river actually made you closer to your neighbors in terms of travel time. I've read a source that claims you could sail from Denmark to England in 3 days with cooperation from the weather in a Viking ship. And that fact, along with some spectacular improvements in shipbuilding innovations taking place in Scandinavia, led to our next little bit of what makes Britain special. Britain came down with a bad case of Vikings. In some ways, the worst case of Vikings in the world. Achoo! One could argue this made for a stronger country eventually. The processes of cultural assimilation and Anglo-Saxon institution building are often cited as consequences of conquest by the Vikings. So let's get specific to what actually happened, treat the stories and legends as stories and legends, and be very respectful of the facts that we have. We won't ignore all the stories and legends because some of them are just so good. Let's stop in and take a look at the land where the miracle would occur. 1,000 years pre-miracle, in the late 8th century, the 700s, what had been a Roman province left to its own devices from around 410 and was conquered by tribes from Denmark, Angles and Jutes and Saxons from Germany, much like the rest of Western Europe was conquered by wandering tribes after the end of the Roman Empire. Now, Britain had about a 150-year period of independence after leaving the Roman Empire. Then was conquered by the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. But only part of the island was conquered. Areas that today we call England, except some parts of the northwest, were taken over by these invaders. But that northwestern England and Wales were not conquered by Anglo-Saxons. Modern Scotland and Ireland were also unconquered. Now, Scotland and Ireland were also never even conquered by the Romans. We can infer that these Anglo-Saxon conquerors were pretty savage about their conquest, but that they didn't just kill off all the Celtic Roman people living in England. We can be pretty confident that they were pretty savage because their language totally won out. With only a few words, my sources say around 50, even entering the English language from Roman Celtic. 50. And by the way, the sources widely agree, which is very arresting because, as we'll see in a later episode, agreement on questions of linguistics is rarer than you might expect. We also know they didn't drive off the inhabitants or slaughter them all because of those DNA tests. You know, they find an ancient skeleton from 10,000 years ago, sequence the DNA or a chunk of it, and compare it to modern people and find who matches best. It's the people living today, right around the same area where the skeleton was found. And we think this is how conquest generally works when we don't otherwise have good documentation. Most people are working the land. Only a few get to live in the big house or the castle, and they're in charge. They're the only ones doing any writing or making art, or at least hiring people with skills like that. Then the foreign invaders come, and unlike the movies in which the barbarians or Vikings come into the village and kill everyone, the new conquerors would kill the people up in the big house and make sure that everyone in the village keeps working the fields so they could live off the villagers' labor. For a conqueror, that might be the whole point. The Viking raids started in the late 8th century, according to the sources, with the sacking of Lindisfarne in 793, and the next year Jarrow, and then Iona in 795. And in 799, Noirmoutier at the Loire estuary in western France. These are all specifically described attacks in written sources. I mean, we know our sources are inadequate because there are also unnamed attacks in Wessex on the Channel coast, and King Offa was preparing Kentish fortresses against pagan invaders in 792. And there are more indications like this in old charters from that time. So our knowledge about this is patchier and more incomplete than most books or podcasts would admit to. Anyway, it seems most of the early attacks were in the northern parts of England, and they were pretty spectacular to the people of the time. Some of my favorite historians of the Viking era include P.H. Sawyer, Gwyn Jones, Donald Logan. Actually, at one time, I think I read every English-language layman version of Viking history in print. Gwyn Jones is particularly good at pointing out exactly how we know things. The historians think that these early raids were done by Vikings who were settling in the northern islands, the Orkneys, Faroes, Hebrides, due to land hunger back home in Scandinavia, where things were going pretty well. The population was rising and filling up all the good land due to a warmer climate than we have today. In a Malthusian world, good times always lead to disaster. Imagine you're a nice kid, a well-brought-up 17-year-old, and you respect your elders. You mostly follow the rules. Sure, you misbehave sometimes, but everyone does, and it's considered normal. You have friends, a few close friends even. People think you're a generally good guy. But there's a dark cloud in your life that you struggle with. Your family has a small farm. A few sheep graze in the mountains in summer. They fish also, because you wouldn't have enough to eat otherwise. And if you've ever been fishing, you know that sometimes the fish don't bite. And so sometimes, in some seasons, you go hungry. You have a brother and a couple of sisters, but recently all the babies your mother has are exposed outdoors to let them die. And this is your normal life, and almost everyone you know lives this way. That's what you get in a pre-modern society when times have been good a couple generations and the Malthusian limits kick in. Remember Daughter 2 in Episode 1 saying I need to de-romanticize the past? We're doing that now. Your farm is too small to subdivide any further between you and your brother when you grow up. So what do? I wonder how much quiet murder there was back in the day in those circumstances. But you're a nice kid. You aren't mean enough or desperate enough yet. Not hard enough to kill your brother. So what does a nice kid do? Well, maybe you join together with a few others in the village, get a larger boat than you need just for fishing, and go plundering. And if this goes well, you come back with goods your family needs, maybe some silver or gold, some slaves to sell, who knows? Some people in the surrounding villages join in your next expedition. But already you've got some problems. How do you know where to go? How do you get there in a world without maps, much less GPS? And even if you did win some gold, how does that get you what you want, which is really a farm of your own for you and that girl you love, where you could live the only lifestyle you've ever known or seen with your own eyes? You can't just go raid your neighbors. Blood feuds are a thing. You might have a great raid, but you wouldn't be safe for the rest of your life. Your children or even grandchildren might expect revenge. Sounds far-fetched? Feuds don't work that way? They used to. There's a whole long digression about Finn and Hengst in the Beowulf poem, where these guys go visiting, enjoy a night's hospitality and feasting, and then when everyone is asleep, they kill their hosts and everyone around and burn down the house for good measure. And these guys are celebrated as heroes. Why? because they were getting revenge for a terrible wrong these poor people's grandfather had done to their grandfather. Tolkien wrote a whole book on this fragment of the Beowulf poem, by the way. Historically, we have 4-generation feuds documented in Northumbria. Start a blood feud with someone who can identify you, and you better learn to sleep lightly. So you have to go far away, where nobody can possibly know you or track you back. There are no movies or TV or magazines or books. There are only people's stories. So you can only hear about places from travelers who are probably traders. Some go from this insight to saying that Vikings were all traders. They would just plunder opportunistically if it looked like they could get away with it. But traders need profits if they're going to stay in business, and keeping lots and lots of armed men around will eat up those profits pretty fast. So if you want to get a warband together, a horde, several shiploads of Vikings, you probably have plunder, the big score, as an intention. And probably you eventually want to buy some land. Even in the conquered country, you may want to buy land. That makes things much cleaner. No local relatives will come after you later, that kind of thing. And that's what a lot of Vikings did. According to the historians, most of the plunder from the early days of Vikinging, if that's a word I can use, didn't end up back in Norway or Denmark like it did in the later periods. They were probably used to buy land in England. It was the 9th century version of recycling. And that farm you buy, maybe a large estate if you were a really good Viking, and maybe just a little hut and some sheep if you had less luck. Anyway, that farm is what you really wanted all along.
That doesn't sound like a solid plan. It seems unlikely to work out.
Yeah, the odds against you would be long. First of all, you'd have to survive the whole process. There were a lot of shipwrecks. You might sail out and never return. You might be killed in battle, die of disease or an infection from a slight wound or even a scratch. You had to keep your share of the plunder safe somehow. You're hanging out with Vikings and plunderers, after all. How many got knifed in their sleep so that the others could get a bigger share? And somehow you had to protect your treasure, probably carrying it around all the time, especially after you and your crew parted ways. You couldn't just deposit the money at the Viking Bank and Trust and use it to make a down payment on a mortgage later. No, you would need to have ready cash and be able to defend it against all comers. They probably had ways to do that, but it wouldn't be easy, and it could easily end in death and failure.
You gave the example of a good kid. Would a good kid go around taking slaves?
Well, back in the day, slavery was pretty common. Estimates vary all over, but some think slaves might have been 1/3 of the population in Viking Scandinavia.
There were black slaves?
No, they'd look like anyone else, which meant white in those places at that time. Slavery in ancient times was everywhere. There could be people captured in war or their descendants, and you might sell yourself into slavery if you were desperate. Plato in ancient Greece was even a slave for a while. Slave taking and trading was a big business. Some whole tribes specialized in it. I think it was the Marcomanni, a German-speaking tribe that specialized in capturing Slavic people and selling them to the Romans as slaves. That's even where the word Slav for a whole language-speaking group of people come from. Slav meant slave for a time. So back then, slaves would just be normal, everyday people. Maybe a fair portion of the people you knew would be slaves or ex-slaves. Oh, Bob is Alice's slave, and he can't marry Carol unless Alice gives permission. Christianity gradually eliminated slavery, but it was slow, and when it was finally eliminated in Europe, there was still serfdom. But we're talking pre-Christian times. Vikings had their own gods, probably similar to the original Anglo-Saxon gods of Tyr or Tyr, Woden or Odin, Thor, and Freya. We've even named the days of the week from Tuesday to Friday for those gods.
Even if you were used to slavery, a Viking would have to steal and kill. How did a good kid do that?
Different value systems. That might be a Season 2 topic, because it's a really interesting question that keeps coming up in history. We just don't realize how much our viewpoint is slanted by all these centuries of Christianity. death and human dignity was just a very different thing than it is in our world. Rising above and overcoming that very human reluctance to kill was a thing celebrated. And it was a way to be admired, to be good at killing the enemy, whoever they might be. I guess it still is. But back then, remember, almost nobody had much wealth. It would be just a few merchants, nobles, or warlords ruling everyone else. So you are really just focusing on stealing from them and killing them when they defend themselves. And you might take some of their people as slaves if that made sense, if the circumstances were right. So a Viking kid wouldn't be a good kid by our standards, our values, but he could be a fine fellow according to his own kith and kin.
Well, if trading led to Vikings finding out about you and coming to attack you or even take your land, why would you do any trading?
Trade is one of the greatest sources of wealth humans have ever discovered. Wealth is enough incentive for some to overcome our hobbit and monkey natures. But I've made a mistake if I implied that trade would be the only way Vikings could learn about a place to raid and vitally have good sailing directions for how to get there, because that was the key, sailing directions you could trust. Another way would be mercenaries returning home.
Vikings were mercenaries?
Yeah, big time. Lots and lots of Scandinavians were. There's a lot of history of mercenaries. Some famous ones are Scandinavian, but there aren't any accounts of Vikings first coming to England as mercenaries. But there are lots of accounts for barbarian conquerors getting their foot in the door that way. I'll give you just two examples. First, we have the account of a British monk named Gildas, who said that after the Romans left Britain, local lords hired Saxon mercenaries who would later turn the tables on their paymasters and started the whole Anglo-Saxon Jutes conquest of England. Another juicy one is Norman, and of course, Norman means Northmen in Old French. They're descendants of Vikings who settled in France earlier. Norman mercenaries fighting for Lombard lords in southern Italy, eventually conquering southern Italy and the island of Sicily for themselves, and establishing a kingdom there in 1054, about 12 years before the Norman conquest of England in 1066.
Well, that's at least a date I've heard of.
Yes, it's said that of the 4 memorable dates in English history, 1066 is the only one people remember.
That was the Battle of Hastings.
Yeah.
And the Vikings were before that.
Yes, for over 250 years, Vikings were fighting in England, also settling down and farming or doing their trades.
Trades? What trades?
Fishing, woodworking, metals, cheesemaking, cattle and livestock raising, normal sorts of ancient crafts. Probably shipbuilding, since so many English words regarding things nautical are of Old Norse origin. But mostly they were farmers and sheep herders. Ancient farmers were not efficient enough to support much population that wasn't directly engaged in food production. But we'd better break here and continue with the stories of Vikings in England next week.
But wait, you didn't explain about Italian Vikings. That sounds too weird and too cool.
Normans would have been French-speaking by then and would have formed an occupying army and a ruling elite that just blended in to be part of the Sicilian, Neapolitan, Calabrese, etc. population after a while. And remember that partly they just took over from the Lombards, a tribe that came out of Scandinavia in late Roman times, originally with the name Longbeards, Langobardi in Latin. They had the best origin story, a legend that used to be among the best-known stories of late antiquity. This is a story where your close attention will be rewarded. 2 tribes were fighting each other for a long day. Neither side won the victory because Odin could not make up his mind which side deserved the victory more. So Odin's wife Frigg came to him and asked him what he was going to do. Odin was reluctant and doubtful that day. He said, "I can't decide. Both tribes are equally brave, tough, and hardy." Frigg pointed out that he had to pick a winner. He sighed and said he would just pick the side that first came back to the battlefield in the morning. The women of one of the tribes prayed to Frigg and sacrificed to her. Frigg came among them and told them what to do. They were to gather their men's weapons and cloaks and tie their hair under their faces to look like beards and appear on the battlefield before first light. As the pinkness of dawn lightened the sky, an army was revealed on the dim battlefield. Frigg stood with Odin and reminded him of his promise the night before. "I did say that," Odin agreed. He delayed a few seconds and then threw a spear over the new army, giving them victory in the battle to come. But he turned to his wife and asked her, "But who are these Longbeards?" And this is a story that repays your close attention. Rewind a bit and listen to it again, and think through all the elements of this origin story. Questions like, who has agency? What is the nature of the gods? What implicit assumptions do the characters have? How will this story be heard and understood differently by a child, an adolescent, or an adult? Next, a couple minutes of conversation with Cami, and then more Vikings next week.
Okay, we'll figure it out.
Hey, Cami, you've had a chance to listen to episode 4. What'd you think?
I really enjoyed hearing from both Knight Rider and Quokka. The fun part on this one, I think, was about the Britain having a bad case of the Vikings before before marrying into a family of Norwegians and traveling in Europe with you and visiting all those Viking museums. I didn't know how far and wide the Vikings had conquered and traveled and settled, and how much they had influenced Europe. I didn't realize how far they had influenced culture in the world. The example of the well-brought-up 17-year-old was fun. The discussion of how value systems are different in times of old than they are today. And the notion that we romanticize the past, but the values were truly different, and they had to be. It was a matter of survival.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, well, thank you very much, Cami.
Oh, one thought I had through the discussion of slavery was, weren't some of those slaves indentured servants? The people who sold themselves into slavery, some of the other things. Indentured servanthood was a thing at that time, wasn't it?
You might refer to many kinds of social, financial relationships people had in medieval times as indentured servitude. Indentured servitude was a term we usually use about the settlement of British North America before the Revolution. You'd pay for your passage with the promise of 4 years as an indentured servant. You had minimal rights. No one could kill you or rape you, for example, though it happened. You could be sold or your contract sold, and you had no say. You could be treated like a slave, but there was a time limit, and then you were free. It was a big feature of immigration to America, where between 40 to 70% of the people, depending on where and when, coming from the British Isles were indentured servants. In the Viking time period, a slave really was a slave. If you were on a small farm with a good family, you might be treated like a servant. But you were really a slave that could be sold away from your family if you were allowed to have a family, and there was no time limit to it, as far as we know. Please click subscribe or follow on your podcast app. If you like the podcast, please tell a friend about it. If you don't, please tell an enemy. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to discuss anything covered in the episode, please feel free to email me at hangingwithhistorypodcast@gmail.com.